How are there so many things on this calendar? Men's Olympic soccer has one big difference in its age restrictions compared to any other Olympic sport. We're going to talk about it today and then we're going to fix it. Welcome to the SportsZu. Zoo Crew, welcome back to part 2 of our Summer Olympics series and our first of what's sure to be many segments on soccer. Today we're going to tackle the one difference that men's Olympic soccer has compared to all of the other Olympic sports, and that is their strange U-23 plus 3 age limitation. Let's get it started with a quote from the GOAT himself, Lionel Messi. He said, "It's hard to think about the Olympics right now because we're in Copa America. It would be 2-3 straight months of not being with the club. And more than anything, I'm not at an age to be in everything. I have to choose carefully and it would be too much to play 2 straight tournaments. I've been very lucky to play in the Olympics. Of winning it together with Messi, it was a wonderful experience on a football level. Olympics, U20, memories I'll never forget." And then he also just said, "It's spectacular to be fortunate enough to go through all that. I hope that the guys who get to enjoy it in the same way that I did because it's special. The Olympics are special, different from anything else." Well, he certainly got that right because the Olympics have an age restriction only allowing players under 23 years of age, except for allowing 3 overage players without any limitation. So recently, the man that Messi beat in the last World Cup had this to say: "My club's position was very clear. So from that moment on, I think I knew I won't be taking part in the games. That's just the way it is, and I understand that too. I'm joining a new team in September, so it's not the best way to start an adventure." Wow, that certainly sounds like a guy who wants to be in the Olympics, and sure enough, Mbappe would love to represent his home country hosting the Olympics right before he switches from PSG to Real Madrid when the club season starts back up. But unfortunately, he's not going to get that choice because clubs do not have to release overage players for the men's Summer Olympic Games. But how did we get to this weird starting point of having this rule? Well, let's take a quick run through the history of soccer at the Olympics. In 1896, the very first Olympics, soccer or any team sport was not a part of the official Olympics, but apparently an unofficial game or tournament occurred, but no great records are really able to be found. Then in both 1900 and 1904, tournaments were played using club or scratch teams, which the IOC considers to be official events, but it is not recognized by FIFA. And sadly enough, this was the only time that US teams were able to get Olympic medals in soccer. Then in 1908, we finally had the first proper international tournament featuring 6 teams. All the players were amateurs in accordance with the Olympic rules, which meant that countries could not send their full senior national teams. Finally, we get to 1924, and it was the first tournament since that 1908 tournament that included non-European teams. In the very next Olympics 4 years later, FIFA realized that the Olympics prevented teams from competing on an equal footing, as the Olympics only allowed amateurs to compete. So FIFA decided they were going to start their own tournament, and the World Cup was born. In 1932, they couldn't figure things out from there, and so to promote the World Cup, they decided to drop soccer from the Olympics for one go-round, but it did return in 1936. Then, during the Cold War, beginning in 1948 and ending in 1980, 23 of the 28 Olympic medals were won by Eastern European countries, the USSR and its satellites, as these athletes were state-sponsored and not considered to be professionals, so they retained their amateur status. And clearly, took advantage of their competition. Finally, in 1984, the IOC decided to admit professional players, but FIFA did not want the Olympics to rival the World Cup, so the IOC and FIFA came to a compromise, such that teams outside of UEFA and CONMEBOL were allowed to field their strongest teams, but those two confederations could not use players that participated in a World Cup. Then they did some additional tweaking in 1988, saying that players from these two confederations who had played less than 90 minutes in a single World Cup were still eligible to participate. In 1992, they made the biggest change of them all, saying that male competitors now have to be under 23 years old and able to participate. But just one Olympics later, 1996, they allowed a maximum of 3 over 23-year-olds to play on the teams with the under 23-year-old roster. And amazingly enough, that's still what we had today. Just as noteworthy, or even more noteworthy, this was also the year of the first women's tournament, and it had no age restrictions, which remains in place today. So let's talk about some of the rules through the IOC's Olympic Charter. In section 42, talking about age limit, it says there may be no age limit for competitors in the Olympic Games other than as prescribed in the competition rules of an international federation, which is abbreviated as IF, as approved by the IOC Executive Board. Now, these international federations are recognized by the IOC, and they are international non-governmental organizations that govern one or several sports at the world level. And the mission and role of the IOC include to establish and enforce the rules concerning the practice of their respective sports. IFs are responsible for the integrity of their sport on the international level and basically have the duty of running all the day-to-day operations to manage and to supervise the development of their sports. So under the Olympic Charter, international federations, and for soccer it is of course FIFA, they are allowed to impose age limits if they would like to. Now, other than soccer, the only sport that does this in the Summer Olympics is boxing. In section 1.1 of the 2024 boxing unit, the boxer's age classification is determined by their year of birth, and men and women's boxers between the ages of 19 to 40 are categorized as boxers. So no one outside of those age ranges is allowed to participate. And in fact, the IOC refused to change its rules to let the legendary Manny Pacquiao box at the age of 45 for the Paris Olympics. Just a decade ago, the age limit was raised from 34 to 40. Had Pacquiao had the desire then, he would have met the criteria to box at the 2016 Rio Games. Now let's talk about FIFA's regulations for the Olympic Football Tournament Games of the 33rd Olympiad, Paris 2024. In paragraph 6, player and officials list, in Article 26.5, it says all players participating in the final competition of the men's tournament shall be born on or after January 1st, 2001. However, a maximum of 3 male players who do not meet this age limit may also be included in the official list of players for the final competition. Article 26.6 says that the women do not have this same restriction. Now, why would FIFA and the IOC do this? Well, as we mentioned earlier, it was a compromise after the IOC introduced professional athletes in 1984. But FIFA did not want the Olympics to rival the World Cup. Therefore, they needed to come up with some sort of regulations to keep World Cup on a different footing than that of the Olympics. And as we noted, it changed in 4 separate Olympics before they finally landed on something that completely stuck. Now, age 23 was selected because European teams qualified through the U-21 European Championship, which was held 2 years before the Olympics. So the 21-year-olds would then be 23-year-olds in the Olympics. Now, just to note, that competition is just held 1 year before the Olympics, so it doesn't really stand as level, which we'll see here shortly. Also, they talked about leveling the playing field, and I'm not exactly sure what to make of that, as you would want to have all the best players from around the world competing, and if certain teams are better than other teams, well, that's kind of just the way it goes. I think we were perfectly happy seeing the Dream Team smack everybody down by 40 or 50 points in every basketball game. So if a European team was able to win by 5 or 6 goals over the rest of the competition, well, so be it, but we know we have a lot of competition in soccer, so that hardly seems to be the case. Lastly, reduction of workload on top players. Well, yeah, we're going to talk about that too a little bit here today. And yeah, there are a lot of events that go on both at the club level and at the national team level, and players are just overworked, at least those at the top of the game. So sure, we want to reduce the workload on the players, but why would we cut out one of the best tournaments in order to do that? That one just doesn't make a lot of sense. However, I have to say, I look back at as many websites trying to gather information that I could, and I could not find any quotes all the way back from 1984 to 1996 where they came up with these rules. I really thought I'd be able to find something, but I just couldn't. I really wanted to see something official that I could bring today, but unfortunately not the case. Therefore, we just generically have to say what it seems that everyone thinks are the reasons. Now, U23, why are we talking about U23? Well, as we noted, U21 European Championships is how they decided to come up with the U23 decision. There's no national level competition that uses U23, and the Asian Games only changed to a U23 format so it would reflect what was already being done at the Olympics. Before that, it was open to all Asian players. Similarly, the Olympic qualifiers do not even include the overage players. So even those direct qualifiers don't even play by the same rules as the Olympics themselves. Basically, the teams that qualify are not particularly relevant for the teams that end up playing in the Olympics. Now, the only non-Olympic qualifying U23 tournament is the Asian Football Federation's biennial event, which itself is a preparatory event for the AFC U23 Asian Cup. So even that is just a preparation for the qualifying tournament. Therefore, everything ties back to the Olympics. If the Olympics didn't have this rule, there really just wouldn't be U23 in soccer. Now, admittedly, there are a few other sports that do typically use U23, and those are athletics, which are track and field, cycling, and volleyball. There are also a couple other random sports that use them for an individual tournament, but these three are the ones that use it most frequently. Now, let's talk about the Olympic qualifiers first for the men's. Now, as we mentioned, players have to be born on or after January 1st, 2001 to be eligible for this year's Paris Olympics. So, the 6 confederations have these events as their qualifiers. CONCACAF had the 2022 U20 Championship, but that only allowed players that were born after January 1st, 2003, so it was not particularly relevant. For UEFA, it was the 2023 European Under-21 Championship, and that one allowed players born after January 1st, 2000. So again, some players who were eligible in that tournament are not eligible in the Olympics. Now, at least the other 4 tournaments had the same age cutoff, and those were the CAF 2023 U23 Africa Cup of Nations, the OFC 2023 Olympic Qualifying Tournament, the CONMEBOL 2024 Pre-Olympic Tournament, and the AFC 2024 U23 Asian Cup. Now, I wanted to have quotes from 2 of the best players of all time, perhaps, in soccer, giving their feelings about the Olympics, but I wanted to extend that to some of the other professional sports that are awfully popular but still find a way to play in the Olympics. So let's start with the NBA. The late great Basketball Hall of Famer Kobe Bryant said, "It's a different feeling playing for your country. When you're playing in the NBA, you're playing for a particular city. But when you're playing for your country, those lines go away. It carries a great honor that goes above and beyond winning the NBA championship. Then Miami Heat forward Kevin Love said, "I think it's anytime you're asked to play for USA basketball, it's really hard to say no. Wearing USA across your chest and getting an Olympic gold medal for your country is maybe the coolest thing you can do." And lastly, Steph Curry, who's finally playing in his first Olympics this year, said, "Being in Paris and representing your country at the highest level, there is no greater experience." Now, when we switch to the Winter Olympics, the NHL has had a tumultuous time determining whether NHL players should play or not play in the Olympics, and it has gone back and forth several times. So, Pittsburgh Penguin great Sidney Crosby had this to say. Remember, he had a golden goal several years ago against Team USA. And he said, "It's an unbelievable experience to see the best players go head-to-head representing their country. From my experience in it, I don't know if you get better hockey than that. It's great to be a part of and great for fans, everyone involved. It's a special thing." And his arch nemesis, Alex Ovechkin of the Washington Capitals, said prior to the 2018 Olympics, when the NHL decided that NHL players would not play in that particular Olympics, he said, "The Olympics are in my blood and everybody knows how much I love my country. Ever since I was a kid and all the time I have played in the NHL, NHL players have played in the Olympic Games. We never have to make choice between our team and our country my whole career. There is nothing like Olympic Games. It is still my dream to win an Olympic gold medal for my country." And well, since he's on Russia, let's hope he does not do that, nor win any more Stanley Cups. But you can certainly understand that he really loves his country and wants to play for them in the Olympics. So let's turn our attention to the TV ratings recently. Now, the World Cup is the most watched sporting event in the world. The 2022 Men's World Cup final between Argentina with Messi and France with Mbappe worldwide had 1.5 billion viewers. However, admittedly, they said there's no traditional measurement that gets you to that specific number. It probably would be something a lot smaller than that if you use those traditional measurements, but that's the number we got out of FIFA. Then in the US in particular, there were 16.78 million who watched on Fox, and then another 9 million who watched on either Telemundo or on Peacock. For the Women's World Cup, and in fact the largest US TV audience for any soccer match, men or women, was in the 2015 final against Japan, where 25.4 million people watched on Fox and another 1.27 million watched on Telemundo. Now, these numbers are about the same as a standard NFL wildcard game or a lesser rated divisional playoff game. Speaking of American football, the 2023 Super Bowl, which was closest in time to the 2022 World Cup, saw the Chiefs and the Eagles play with 115.1 million people watching on Fox and Fox Deportes, and then another 40 million watched internationally. Then for 2024, again the Chiefs, this time against the 49ers, we saw 123.7 million people watch in the USA between CBS, Univision, Nickelodeon, and Nick at Night, with a really impressive increase to 62.5 million internationally. So as you can see, the World Cup final globally far exceeds that of the Super Bowl. Now, the 2020 Olympics saw 3.05 billion unique viewers across linear TV and digital platforms worldwide. And in the US in particular, in prime time, there was an average of 15.5 million viewers on NBC, which was down from 27.5 million in 2016. There were over 120 billion minutes of Olympic programming that were watched across all NBC Universal platforms, and another 150 million viewers had watched some portion of the Olympics on TV. But although that sounds impressive, this was the lowest number since 1988. The article did say to note that this audience decline was on par with the erosion of other primetime TV over the last 5 years due to streaming, COVID, and any other particular reason. Now let's pause just a moment here to state the obvious. Maybe the Olympic ratings wouldn't have fallen just as much if you actually had the senior national teams for men's soccer compete in the Olympics. I think we would have gotten a little bit better ratings based on what we saw from the World Cup. So let's briefly note the difference between men's Olympic soccer and women's Olympic soccer. For the women, the Olympics are a senior competition and are calculated equally in FIFA's ranking system to the Women's World Cup. But they are neither of those things for the men. Also, the Olympics are included in the Women's International Match Calendar, which we will talk about, but the Olympics are not on the Men's International Match Calendar, as clubs must release the 3 overage players in order to participate. But the clubs are not required to do so. However, it must be noted that for the players that do qualify as under 23, the clubs are required to release those players for the Olympics due to an agreement between the IOC and FIFA and for the spirit of the Olympic Games. So if the Olympics are not a senior event for the men, what are the senior events? Well, first and foremost, we have the World Cup. We know that happens every 4 years. The next one will be in June 2026. But there is one senior primary event for each of the 6 confederations, which we have listed here. Now for CONCACAF, it's a little uncertain what they're going to do. It seems to be up in the air whether there will be a 2-year cycle or a 4-year cycle. So we may see another event in June 2025, or they may just decide to skip that and have it go to 2027. I'm pretty amazed this has not been nailed down yet. So it being this late in the game, I have to think it's going to get pushed to a 4-year cycle and go to 2027. All of the other confederations also use a 4-year cycle except for CAF, which has a 2-year cycle for the Africa Cup of Nations. So it will occur in January of 2026. And you can see here we have 2 of the 4 confederations use a January start date for their primary event, while the other 4 use a June starting date. And in fact, we have 3 of them going on at once right now, with the Euro, with the Nations Cup, and with Copa America. Now the men's secondary events, not all of the confederations have one. CONMEBOL and the OFC do not have secondary events. However, for the others, well, they are all over the place with how often they are played. The Asian Games, which we talked about a little bit earlier, they have a 4-year cycle, but we did note that this was a U-23 tournament. Now for CAF and for UEFA, the African Nations Championship and the Nations League respectively both have a 2-year cycle. Then for CONCACAF, the new Nations League there, the change in format, they're amazingly going to an annual format. I don't know why they need to play that often, but that is currently the plan. Switching to the women's side, you can see here we have the Olympics included amongst the senior events, as well as the Women's World Cup, which will take place in May of 2027. Again, you can see here the only confederation that has a 2-year cycle is the CAF, which has the Women's Africa Cup of Nations on that 2-year cycle, with the next coming up in just a few months in August of 2024. All the others are currently using a 4-year cycle. However, we will note that the AFC Women's Asian Cup will have its next one in 2029. For women's secondary events, we have the AFC and CONCACAF having 4-year cycles with their next events in 2026, and UEFA's W Nations League has a 2-year cycle, so the next one will be in September 25. The other 3, joining CONMEBOL and the OFC, is also CAF for the women. But on top of these events, since it's on the senior calendar for the women, we also have to talk about the Olympic qualifiers for the women. In 2022, we had the CONCACAF W Championship, which was also its secondary tournament, as well as UEFA's W Nations League Finals, which were just in February 2024, which was its secondary tournament. But CONMEBOL, since it only has a primary tournament, used that, the America Femenina, which was held back in July of 2022, serves as its Olympic qualifier. The other 3 confederations each have separate Olympic qualifying tournaments. So let's talk about that international match calendar. First, for the men, there are fixed date for the International A matches, which are those primary events that we talked about. They typically last for about a month in time. And as we saw, they were in January and then in June, typically. On top of that, there are currently 5 periods of 9 days from Monday to the following Tuesday night in March, June, September, October, and November, in which up to 2 international games may be played. So literally that means you leave your club, you go for 9 days, you play 2 games with your national team, and you go right back to your club. Pretty wild, right? Then in 2026, that's going to change a little bit, where the September and October windows will be merged into one 16-day period in which up to 4 international games may be played. That does seem to be a good idea. Instead of leaving 3 straight months for 2 games each in September, October, and November, at least September and October are merged to get you a longer time with some continuity with your team, hopefully reducing travel a little bit. For the women, certainly it starts the same. The fixed dates for the International A matches. Then, instead of 5 periods, they have 6 periods, and they are of different lengths of time. They can either be 9, 10, or 13 days from that Monday morning until the following Tuesday, Wednesday, or Saturday night. And these occur in February, April, May and June, July, October, and November and December. And you can either play 2, 3, or 4 games during these time periods, depending on how long that specific period is. Now, beginning in 2026, they are going to reduce that to 5 periods, in which there will be 9-day 2-game windows in June and October, and then 10-day 3-game windows in February, March, April, and November, December. So that does seem to be a little bit better for everyone there. One less time away from your club. So let's go to the calendar. Let's look at what the international calendar looks like right now. Tried to land on everything that we could. The men's international periods are in black, the women's are in red, and then the Olympics are in blue. And you can see that there's pretty much always something going on internationally. Really astounding to see just how much time is devoted to international play and these particular 2, 3, or 4 game windows, how much they interrupt club play, and you just have to go take a break and play for your national team. Really amazing. And it just never stops from there. You just keep going. You seem to always be qualifying for one sort of tournament, and then you finally play in that tournament, and then you move to the next. There's a lot of overlap and just a pretty wild schedule for international play. Certainly very messy. So it looks to me like the international match calendar just has too many starts and stops to international play. Again, you just have to go to your national team, play for 9 to 10 to 13 days, and then leave and go right back to your club and do that 5 or 6 times throughout the year. This also just has way too much international travel. At least when you're with your club, you're only playing in one country almost all of the time, unless you happen to be in a Champions League going on at some particular point. But for the most part, you're mostly staying domestically. But when you add in the international match calendar, you're going all over. You could be anywhere. Now, granted, most of these are within your confederation, so you theoretically are just going to neighboring countries that are not too far away. But still, it seems to be a lot of travel for everyone by doing it the way we're doing it. One other key topic that we need to talk about, but we're not going to make that the focus of today's video, but it is overuse and injuries for today's players. Now, the quick example, Kylian Mbappe, who we talked about earlier, in 2023, he played in 63 total matches, which of course is more than 1 match per week for the entire year. So he had a 34-game league season. He then played in the UEFA Champions League. He played in the French Super Cup, and then he also played in the Coupe de France. So that was 63 total matches. He just had to go everywhere. Of course, we know It could be more in any particular year, depending on how far a team goes in a Champions League or their national team advances in any particular event. So we've seen players play up to about 70 games, which we will talk about here, but certainly overuse certainly seems to be a thing. So it's just really hard when players just keep getting asked to participate in more and more events. So Mbappe said, "Personally, I'm not against playing that many matches," and he specifically meant 70 in this particular quote. "But we won't be able to be good every time and give the public the spectacle they expect. In the NBA, players don't play every game and franchises practice load management. But if I said, 'I'm tired, I'm not going to play on Saturday,' it wouldn't go down well." And I certainly understand that sentiment. We certainly see NHL players go through 80-some games not taking any breaks for a very physical sport if they don't happen to get injured. And of course, we know MLB plays 162 games. It's a lot easier to take a day off there. But for soccer, when you typically see players being recommended to have at least 3 days off in between games, and often playing just once a week, similar to football, American football. So let's talk about each of these confederations and all of the national events that they have. First and foremost is the World Cup qualifying for the 2026 World Cup, which is taking place in June and July of 2026. For UEFA, who we'll talk about first, they have 55 teams in the confederation and 16 teams qualify for the World Cup. Now for the World Cup qualifying matches, they have a first round that includes all teams, and it takes place during those international windows from March of 2025 to November of 2025. And out of that first round, 8 of the 55 teams qualify, which are the 8 teams that are first place in their group. Then we go to the second round, which takes place in March of 2026. The 12 first round runners-up plus the 4 best Nations League teams qualified for the second round, and they whittle it down then to another 8 teams to qualify to get you to the 16 teams to qualify for the World Cup. So UEFA's primary championship is the European Championship, or the Euro, and it is currently taking place in June and July of 2024. All 55 teams are eligible to participate. Now, we will note that Russia's currently suspended, so there is a little issue there. They're not playing right now for obvious reasons, but we don't need to get into those kind of details today. So there are 24 teams that advance to the proper Euro tournament. So we have qualifying first again here from March to November of 2023. We had the qualifying group stage in which 20 teams qualified. Then we had playoffs, which featured the next 12 best teams to get the final 3 spots to get to 23 teams, plus the host was Germany. They didn't have to qualify, they got an automatic spot to get you to your 24 teams. Then their secondary event is the 2024-25 Nations League, and its 2-year cycle. It is about to start in September of 2024, and it actually runs all the way through March of 2026. All 55 teams participate in this. There's a league phase that goes from September to November of 24. Then we have the League A quarterfinals, as well as the League AB relegation playoffs and the League BC relegation playoffs. Then we get the finals for League A, which are the semifinals, the third place game, and the finals in June of 2025. And then finally, we get the League CD relegation playoffs for March of 2026. So as you can see here, we just have a whole lot of qualifying here going on, and then a whole lot more soccer that is played when we finally get to it. Of course, the Nations League, the entire part, is the actual league, whereas the Euro itself is just a 1-month event, and of course the World Cup is just a 1-month event. So those have 2 pretty long qualifiers. So we have 13 months to figure out the qualifiers for the World Cup for a 1-month event, which we will admit is actually the best of all of the confederations other than the OFC, and 13 months to figure out the qualifiers for the Euro for a 1-month event. Then we have 19 months to complete the Nations League. So it is a biennial event, which is 24 months, and it actually spans 19 of those 24 months, even though you're not actually playing games in each of those 19 months. So let's look at this particular calendar in a little bit more depth. We're not going to do that for each confederation, but we want to do it once to show the actual schedule, starting between 2023 and ending essentially with the World Cup in 2026. You can see we have Euro qualifying first in 2023, and then ending it early 2024 before we get to the Euro in June of 2024. Then we also have the Nations League picking up right after that in the fall of 2024, and it continues all the way throughout 2025 and finally ends in March of 2026. But of course, it almost never ends, because you can see the prior Nations League actually had its semifinals and finals in June of 2023, and then the 2026-27 Nations League will actually pick up right after the World Cup and begin in September of 2026. Then of course we have the World Cup qualifying, which takes place throughout the entire 2025 and concludes in March of 2026 before we finally actually play the World Cup in June of 2026. So basically, for 4 straight years, there is something going on basically at all times in the international match calendar. And that's without having the Olympics. So we're not going to talk about them all here completely, but we want to briefly stop here. For the AFC, we of course have World Cup qualifying, and it takes place from October of 2023 through November of 2025. Then the next Asian Cup will be in 2027, January of 2027 to be specific, and it actually begins qualifying all the way back with the World Cup qualifying in October of 23 and ends in March of 2026. So we pretty much are always qualifying for the Asian Cup. Lastly, its secondary event will be the 2026 Asian Games. It is also in a 4-year cycle, and it will take place in September of 2026. And there's no actual qualifying for that, fortunately. You just play in the games with all the teams are eligible. We didn't have specific dates for 2026, so I did use the ones from 2022 here. Noting the time span, we have 26 months to complete qualifying for the World Cup. Then because the Asian Cup uses the first 2 rounds of the World Cup qualifying, it actually has a 40-month qualifying period. Incredible. Absolutely incredible. And lastly, because 18 of the 24 teams qualify for the Asian Cup at the end of the first 2 rounds, these teams qualify 32 months before the Asian Cup even begins. Pretty amazing. You basically don't even have the same team 32 months earlier. So these are really extreme differences in the amount of time it takes to qualify. Next, we have the CAF. Its World Cup qualifying is from November 23 to November 25. Its next primary event will be the 2025 Africa Cup of Nations on its 2-year cycle, and the qualifying is from March 2024 to November 2024 for a January 2026 event. And its secondary event is the Africa Nations Cup, and it has a 2-year cycle, but the date is to be determined, but it seems that it will take place in September of 2024. But we used here the information from 2022. So the CAF, it takes 25 months to complete qualifying for the World Cup. CONCACAF, back here at home, things are pretty complicated here as well. We have the qualifiers from March of 2024 to November of 2025. The CONCACAF Gold Cup, as we noted, we're not exactly sure when it will happen, but at least it uses the Nation League results to qualify 12 of the 16 teams. And then there will be separate qualifiers, but we use the 2023 info. Probably happen in June of 2025 or 2027, whenever the next one happens to be. And lastly, we have the 2024-25 Nations League, which we do believe will be held annually, and it will start in September of 24 and end in March of 25. So for CONCACAF, it takes 21 months to qualify for the World Cup. Then we have CONMEBOL. Now, fortunately, they don't have a secondary national event, which keeps things much easier for us. The World Cup qualifying is, however, a 2-year process from September of 2023 to September of 2025, which is amazing enough when you see that there are only 10 teams participating for this World Cup qualifying. 6 of them actually make it, and then 1 other team gets to participate in the playoff. So you're only eliminating completely 3 teams in an entire 2-year span there. Pretty amazing. But of course, the Copa is their primary event. It's going on right now. All 10 teams qualify, plus there are 6 invited guests, which the CONCACAF teams qualified through the results of the 2023-24 Nations League. So as we noted there, again, 25 months to complete the World Cup qualifying, but fortunately there's no need to complete any qualifying matches for the Copa. Then in the OFC, which certainly has the least skilled teams of the confederations, so only 1 team plus 1 playoff team gets to qualify for the Olympics. So in their 11-team confederation, we have qualifiers go from September of 24 and quickly end compared to everyone else in March of 2025. Their primary event is the Nations Cup. It is also taking place right now. It has some small qualifiers since there are only 11 teams in the confederation and there are only 8 teams in the proper tournament and 7 teams are automatic qualifiers. So only the bottom 4 teams have to participate in qualifiers to get the 1 final spot. But for this particular Nations Cup, American Samoa did not register for the event. So those qualifiers only had 3 teams to get the 1 final team to qualify for the 8-team Nations Cup. So fortunately, it only takes 7 months to qualify for the World Cup here, but it is indeed only for 1 team plus 1 playoff team. So after looking at all of that, what can we say? Well, there's just entirely too much qualification going on, except for the OFC. It takes between 13 months and 26 months to qualify for the World Cup. Just entirely way too long. So with all that, let's get right to our proposal to fix the Olympics and the international match calendar. The only way to get the Olympics onto the men's international match calendar is to rearrange and simplify and reduce everything else on the international match calendar. So our goal here, because the men's Olympic soccer event is the only one with those strange rules to have the U-23 plus 3 overage player rule, we want to instead make it just like every other event and not have that age limitation, except for boxing, which has the 40-year limit. But if a 40-year-old player in soccer is able to qualify, let him play. Maybe Messi will be able to make it for the next time around when he finally turns 40. So with that, let's get to our proposal to add the national teams to the Olympics, and the only way to do that is to fix and simplify the men's senior event calendar. So how do we do that? So let's talk about a couple of things with adding the Olympics to the international match calendar. First, congratulations FIFA, you've done it. You've got the biggest sporting event in the world. Yes, your World Cup is officially too big to fail. You don't have to worry about any of the problems that you may have had at the very beginning. The Olympics will not surpass the World Cup in importance. World Cup is number 1, but the Olympics certainly deserves to be on even footing in importance as it is with the women's Olympic soccer. So they both deserve to be primary international events. Also, we also need to help to improve the ratings for the Olympics now. We saw that ratings were down across the board for the 2020 Olympics, which we will note again took place in 2021 due to COVID, but everything is down, and I think that it is safe to say that there is no better way to improve ratings than to add the senior national teams to the Olympics. And lastly, and maybe most importantly, the players want to play in this. Yes, a 36-year-old Messi somehow is even considering playing in the Olympics with one of those 3 overage spots is really remarkable in itself, coming right off of a Copa and being in the middle of an Inter-Miami season. So, yeah, I think it's safe to say players will want to play. Mbappe certainly wanted to represent his country during their host Olympics. So I'm sure if you asked many soccer players, they would want to play too. Yes, maybe they don't think about it that much because it's not really ever been much of an option, but if the full national teams were there, they would love to represent their country. But of course, won't this tax the players even more than they are already being overused? And yes indeed, that is quite true if you don't do anything else and just throw it in there. So what do we have to do? We have to fix that international match calendar. So what we're going to do is revamp that qualification system for the World Cup and for the other events and the calendar itself. So for the calendar, it will have a 4-year rotation with the Olympics as the final event on the calendar. The World Cups, both men's and women's, will remain completely unchanged. Yes, even FIFA changed their own World Cup for Qatar in 2022 and played that thing in November, but we're not going to do that. We're going to leave it right where it is. We're going to beat you, FIFA. It's going to stay right there in June and July. And FIFA, you also want to have this Club World Cup every 4 years, so we're going to do it. It's going to stay on the calendar. We're going to leave it as part of the international match calendar. It will be a dead period for national teams. Perhaps we can allow some friendlies to go on before and after the actual Club World Cup proper, but for all intents and purposes, it will be a dead period. So, all primary confederation championships will now be on a 4-year cycle. Sorry to Africa, as you're going to be stuck with a 4-year cycle for your Africa Cup of Nations instead of a 2-year cycle, but it will be the best way to make sure everything fits that calendar. And these will be completed in one of 2 windows no more than 1 year prior to the World Cup. The secondary confederation events will be on a 2-year cycle for all confederations that choose to play them and will not be in the same year as the World Cup. So if a federation does not have a secondary confederation event, it shall have a separate Olympic qualifier. So let's talk about this simplification of the international match calendar. We will no longer have 5 or 6 windows where players need to leave their club teams to play for the national teams. Instead, we're just going to have 2 windows of 2 months each. First in January and February, and then in June and July. Therefore, the club teams will have the other 2 windows, much longer windows, from March to May, and then from August through December. I do want to note again here that the Club World Cups will be on the international match calendar, so they will not actually interfere with the 2 club team windows. So, the primary confederation events shall take place in 3 consecutive windows for the men and 3 of 4 windows for the women. Due to the Men's World Cup where it's on the calendar, there will need to be a 1 window break for the women in their confederation events. Now the secondary confederation events, if applicable, the first will be in a primary confederation event window, and if possible, it will be used as part of the qualification for the primary confederation event. Then the second event will be the Olympic qualifier for that confederation. So what we want to stress here with reducing the qualifiers is that each event will serve for the qualifier for the next until we get to the end of the cycle in the Olympics. So the first secondary event, as we noted, if possible, will be a part of the qualification process for the primary event. Then the primary event itself, aka the Euro or Copa, it will be the qualifier for the World Cup. There will be no separate World Cup qualifying tournament. And if there are tiebreakers for spots in the World Cup, they will be completed with the primary event, or if there is an additional window available, in that subsequent international window right before the World Cup. So here's our specific example. The Confederation has 6 World Cup bids. There are 4 teams that lose in the quarterfinals of their primary event. Obviously, when you're in a knockout stage, you go from 8 down to 4, down to 2, down to 1. So in the quarterfinals, you've got 8 teams. So 4 teams lose in the quarterfinals. Those 4 losing teams would have a playoff to get you to the last 2 bids. And it would be up to the Confederation to determine how those 2 bids are determined in what kind of playoff that they want to have. So then once we have those teams qualified and we actually play the World Cup, what do we have for qualification here? Well, the final 4 teams in the World Cup automatically qualify for the Olympics, regardless of their confederation. It doesn't matter if you have 4 UEFA teams making the final 4 of the World Cup. All 4 of them are going to qualify for the Olympics, and they will still get their other additional bids. So the remaining Olympic bids beyond those 4 automatic qualifiers will be determined through either the secondary event or a separate Olympic qualifying event. So depending on the format of the secondary event or Olympic qualifying event, perhaps better results in the World Cup should earn these teams better seeding, or maybe they get to advance to a certain phase, like the knockout phase. They may get an automatic spot in the secondary events knockout phase, and they don't have to go through an earlier group phase. Who knows? That's up to the Confederation, but their results in the World Cup certainly can help them in the Olympic qualifying secondary event or a separate Olympic qualifying event. Now, the Olympic qualifying event itself, it may, but it does not have to include all teams in the Confederation. Otherwise, it would basically just be a secondary event. So if a large confederation like the AFC does not want to have all of its teams participate in an Olympic qualifying event, it does not have to. Of course, they have the Asian Games currently to be a secondary event, but just as an example, they may do that. So this is a video about the Summer Olympics, so let's talk a little bit in more detail about the Olympic bids themselves. We are now at the end of the calendar. We've gone through the primary events, we've gone through the World Cup, we've gone through the secondary event or the Olympic qualifying tournament. So let's get to how many bids each team will get. For the men's tournament, there are 16 teams that play in the Olympics themselves. So you can see we have a nice little chart here for the current bid setup and then what our proposed bid setup will be. You can see in the current setup, there are 3 bids each for the AFC, for the CAF, and for the UEFA, 2 for CONCACAF and CONMEBOL, 1 for the OFC, 1 for the final spot between the AFC and CAF. So in this, under our plan here, our proposed will be that the World Cup has those 4 automatic qualifying bids. The host will still also get a bid. That gives us 11 more spots. That perfectly gives us a nice distribution of 2 teams each out of AFC, CAF, CONMEBOL, CONCACAF, and UEFA, and then just the 1 lone spot for the OFC. Specifically for men's Olympic qualifying, let's get into a little bit more detail. How do we get to those 16 teams? For all confederations except for the AOFC, the team with the best World Cup result outside of the Final 4 will earn 1 bid. Then the winner of the secondary event or Olympic qualifying event will earn the other bid. So there's 2 bids in each of these 5 confederations. We're gonna get 1 from the World Cup and 1 from the secondary event or Olympic qualifying event. Any necessary tiebreaker matches needed shall be played after the conclusion of the secondary event or Olympic qualifying event. Then for the OFC, well, they only get 1 bid. So the winner of the Olympic qualifying event as well as the best results from the World Cup, those 2 teams, if they're different teams, they will probably be the same team, New Zealand. And if they're different teams, they will play a 1-game playoff to determine that 1 Olympic bid. Now let's go to an example for those 5 other confederations. We'll just do a quick UEFA example here. We're going to say that Spain and Portugal both reach the round of 8 in the World Cup, or the quarterfinals, if you will. So let's say that Spain then wins the secondary event, which is the UEFA Nations League. Spain will then receive one bid for the secondary event, and Portugal will then take the World Cup bid. So that will easily get the 2 bids there. However, if neither Spain nor Portugal wins the Nations League, then whoever does win the Nations League will get that 1 bid. But then Spain and Portugal, they're still tied for the 1 bid through the World Cup, so they will play a 1-game playoff at the conclusion of the Nations League to determine that bid through the World Cup. Now let's get a little bit more nuanced here with the Nations League. Let's say if France is the host for the Olympics and they win the Nations League, or England wins the Nations League, which does not participate in the Olympics due to the entire UK being split up as it is, or if a World Cup Final Four team wins the Nations League, certainly very possible that that could happen, then what do we do then? So then the runner-up in the Nations League will then receive the bid for the secondary event. That certainly makes sense. They're the best remaining team through the Nations League. So if Spain or Portugal is that runner-up, they're both going to receive the bids. One will receive the runner-up spot through the secondary event. The other will receive the World Cup bid. If neither of them is the runner-up, however, then Spain and Portugal are still tied. They're going to go right back and play that 1-game playoff to get the World Cup bid. So now let's go to the women. It's a little trickier actually, because right now there are only 12 teams that participate in the Olympics. Certainly I think we could get the 16 teams here pretty easily, so hopefully they do that. But for our purposes, we're going to assume it stays with 12 teams only. So you can see the current format there on the left. What we're going to do here on the right, we've got our 4 World Cup automatic qualifiers. We've got the host team. That takes away 5 of the 12 spots. So let's just give 1 spot each to each of the confederations, and then we need to have a playoff that will include 5 of the 6 confederations. OFC does not usually get 2 bids as is, so they're not going to be involved in the playoff. Instead, the other 5 will each get 1 playoff team. So here's our rules then for the World Olympic qualifying. All confederations except the OFC, we have the winner of the secondary event or Olympic qualifying event earning that 1 bid. Then, for the playoffs, we go back to the World Cup. The team with the best World Cup result outside the Final Four will go into an inter-confederation playoff to earn the final bid. We plan on that being a straight knockout of some sort to get down from 5 teams to 1 team as quickly as possible. So it would be nice if it were only 4, but we're going to have some funky sort of way to get there with 5 teams instead. But in the interest of time, we don't want to have a bunch of tiebreakers going on here with World Cup results. There could be 3 teams in a quarterfinal or a round of 16. So we don't want to have a whole bunch of teams going into this specific playoff. Each confederation will be limited to have 1 participate in this playoff. So the confederation will have its own tie-breaking criteria to determine its representative to play in the playoff, to quickly as possible get us down to that 1 final spot for the Olympics. And of course, for the OFC, it will be the exact same. The Olympic qualifying event versus World Cup best result team, they will go head-to-head and have that 1-game playoff. So let's actually look at a calendar and see how this is going to work. In year 1, which is an odd year, we will start off the calendar in window number 1, January and February. We will possibly see qualifiers for the primary confederation event. You also could see a separate tournament for the first of 2 secondary events, but hopefully that secondary event will be part of the qualification of the primary event. Either way, those 2 things will hopefully be merged into 1, and we'll have a pretty full schedule in that very first window. Then we get to the second window, June or July. Now, as we said earlier, you either have your event here in this second window to be 1 year before the World Cup, or we can go to the next window, the January-February window for year 2, an even-numbered year, same year as the World Cup. That can be your event. So you have 2 choices to hold your event. Probably will stay in the same ratio as we have it now, where 4 confederations have their event in June and 2 confederations have theirs in January, February. So that is our primary event schedule. It will take place over 3 windows. You could have it in only 2 windows if you want, but either way, amongst these 3 windows, you figure out how to have your qualifiers and have your primary event itself. Then we get to the World Cup in its current spot, where it always is. It is in year 2 in June and July. So year 3, the next odd year, we will have our second in the biennial secondary events if that confederation has them. If they don't have them, we then in its place have the Olympic qualifying event. Either way, these 2 events will then be your Olympic qualifiers. Then in June and July, we do not have anything here. It is a dead period for men's international play due to the Women's World Cup. We don't want the men to overlap with the Women's World Cup. So let's go to year 4. We then have the Club World Cup in our last even-numbered year here. It will actually give us 2 straight periods where we are not going to have a lot of international team play, but we want to have that Club World Cup, apparently, according to FIFA, so we're going to include it here. It just fits nicely here when not that much else is needed to go on, so we will place it here. Then we get to our final event, which of course is then the Olympics in the spot where it always is. The World Cup and the Olympics very nicely are in every other year patterns, so they will remain that way. The Olympics is a much shorter event, about 2.5 weeks, so there's plenty of other time. We can have some international friendlies going on either before or after the Olympics, depending on where it lands. So that can be kind of the tune-up to get us ready to go into the following year 1 after that. Then on the women's side, it's moved around a little bit more, but year 1, right off the bat, we're going to start with the Women's Club World Cup to have things go a little bit differently. Then in June and July, we're going to actually have that first qualifying period for the women's primary event. Then, unfortunately, it's a little goofy here, but the secondary event, if the confederation has one, and there's only 3 that have them for the women, it will fall in year 2, January, February, as well as the second qualifying period, or the event itself for the women if they want to have that. Probably that will only happen if they don't have a secondary event, but they could have it there if they want to. Otherwise, we then have the off period for the Men's World Cup in June and July of World 2. So we go right to January, February of year 3, window number 1. We will have the event there instead in January and February for the Confederation primary event. Then we get to the Women's World Cup in June and July, which then nicely then leads us into year 4 with either the secondary event or the Olympic qualifying event, and then right then into the final window where we will again have the Olympics. So briefly, let's look at this all together. Not much to say about it, but everything falls nicely into these 2 windows, so I think it fits all pretty well. So there you have it. We've actually really simplified our international match calendar. If we go back, look at that old calendar. We have red and black everywhere, all over the board. Now it is much more streamlined. We know where these events are going to be. There probably will be more rest periods for these top players to get some breaks in the qualifying process and not having nearly as many random matches or friendlies or qualifying matches amongst all these different international periods. So I think we're in much better shape here to keep everyone's workload a little bit better under control while still having all of the events, and most importantly for today's video, adding the men's soccer event to the Summer Olympics. So there you have it, Zoo Crew. We've officially fixed men's Olympic soccer and at the same time fix the international match calendar. Wow, 2 birds with 1 stone. You can't beat that. So until we get to the club calendar and fix that at a later date, we'll see you next time for part 3 of our Olympic series. Thanks for watching, the SportsZu. No, no, no! Back to the drawing board.